The storm had been growling across the valley for hours when Elijah Carter guided his tired horse toward the abandoned barn at the edge of Ridge Hollow, hoping only for a dry corner to rest in, but the moment he pushed open the warped wooden doors, the beam of his lantern caught something that made his breath freeze, a tiny figure curled up in the straw, trembling, barefoot, her little dress soaked through with rain, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold together the pieces of a world already shattered. He stepped forward slowly, whispering, "Hey there, sweetheart, it's okay," but the girl jerked back with a soft gasp, her wide gray eyes shining like frightened moonlight, and for a moment they simply stared at one another, two strangers caught in the middle of a storm that neither had asked for, until she finally whispered with a quivering lower lip, "Please don't hurt me," and Elijah, whose life had been nothing but wandering, drifting, surviving, felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years, a need to protect, a need to stay, so he lowered himself to one knee, set his lantern aside, and said gently, "I won't hurt you, honey. I promise. What's your name?" But she only hugged her knees tighter, her little chin trembling, and whispered so softly he barely heard it over the wind, "Mama told me not to talk to strangers," and that single sentence, fragile as a candle flame, carried more fear than Elijah had heard in any outlaw's threat. He softened his voice further, telling her his name, telling her she was safe, and after nearly a full minute she finally inched closer, enough that he could see the streaks of dried tears on her cheeks, and whispered, "My name's Clara," a name that sounded as small and breakable as she looked. Elijah pulled off his coat and draped it around her shoulders, noticing the bruises on her arms, the dirt on her face, the way she flinched even at kindness, and every instinct in him burned to know who had left her here alone. But before he could ask, Clara suddenly pressed her finger to her lips and whispered, "Shoo, you gotta be quiet. Mama said to hide." Mama said they were coming, and that single sentence tightened every muscle in Elijah's body. He scanned the barn, the fields outside, the dark waving of the grass beyond the broken window, and then he asked quietly, "Who's coming, Clara?" But instead of answering, she crawled toward the barn door as if drawn by something beyond it, her tiny hand reaching for the crack in the wood, her eyes filling with tears again, and then, barely audible, she whispered words that made Elijah's heart slam against his ribs, "Mama's dying outside." Elijah rushed to her, his hand gently but firmly pulling her back as the storm roared louder, and he said, "Clara, honey, what happened to your mama?" But Clara only shook her head violently, sobbing. "Mama said not to look. Mama told me to run. Mama told me to hide from the men with the knife." And Elijah felt the cold of the storm seep into his bones. He knew Ridge Hollow had been plagued by a drifter rumored to be violent, a man seen lurking around isolated farms, and suddenly every rumor felt too real. The barn creaked under the wind as Elijah lifted Clara into his arms, her tiny hands clutching the collar of his shirt as if he were the last safe thing in the world. He moved carefully to the door and peered out into the darkness, the storm flashing enough lightning to reveal the fields, muddy, torn, and horrifyingly quiet. "Clara," he whispered, "can you show me where your mama is?" She pointed one shaky finger toward the line of trees behind the barn. Elijah felt the weight of responsibility settle heavy on his shoulders, heavier than anything he'd carried in years, and he whispered, "Stay close to me. Don't let go of my shirt, all right?" She nodded, though her whole body shook. The moment they stepped outside, the wind nearly ripped the coat from her shoulders, and Elijah shielded her as best he could, guiding her through the mud as she whispered directions, "This way. Mama fell here, then she crawled, then she said to hide," and each word made the knot in his stomach twist tighter. Then, as they approached the trees, Elijah froze. There was a shape on the ground, barely visible, half covered by branches and storm debris. Clara let out a tiny cry, "Mama," and tried to run to her, but Elijah caught her, whispering, "Let me check first." He placed her under a low branch for shelter and approached the figure. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating a woman face down in the mud, her back soaked in something darker than rain. Elijah knelt, turned her gently, and felt the sickening truth. She was alive, but barely, her breath shallow, her skin gray, her eyes fluttering. She gasped when she saw him, desperate, terrified, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength, whispering with blood-choked breaths, "He's coming back for her, don't let him take my baby." Elijah squeezed her hand, promising she was safe, but her eyes were losing focus, her breaths fading like a dying flame. Clara crawled to her mother, sobbing, "Mama, please wake up." And the woman used the last of her strength to brush Clara's cheek, whispering, "I love you. Run if you hear him, the men with," but before she finished, her hand fell, and her breathing stopped. Clara screamed for her mama as Elijah wrapped his arms around her, shielding her from the storm and the horror she should never have seen, and he whispered, "I'm here, Clara. I'm not leaving you. I'll keep you safe, no matter what," even though he knew the danger was far from over. In the distance, through the roar of the storm, Elijah suddenly heard something else, footsteps, slow, dragging, deliberate. Someone was out there. Someone watching. Someone returning. Elijah scooped Clara into his arms and ran back toward the barn as lightning split the sky again, illuminating a figure at the far edge of the field, a man, standing perfectly still, facing them. Elijah's heart pounded as he slammed the barn doors shut, dropped the wooden bar across them, and whispered urgently, "Clara, stay behind me." The child clung to his leg as the wind howled, the footsteps outside drawing closer, and Elijah knew he had stumbled into something far darker than a storm, something that would not end tonight, something that would pull him and this fragile little girl into a battle for survival they never asked for. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would protect Clara with everything he had, even at the cost of his own life. And as the barn shook under a sudden heavy blow from outside, Clara's small voice whispered through the darkness once more, trembling like a dying candle, "That's him. Mama said the man with the knife always comes back." The barn walls shuddered again as the men outside slammed something heavy against the doors, each blow echoing through the rafters like the heartbeat of something monstrous, and Elijah pulled Clara behind him, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver at his belt, a weapon he hadn't fired in months, maybe years, but tonight felt like the kind of night that dragged old skills from the grave. The lantern flickered violently as the wind howled through the cracks in the boards, and Clara whispered, "Is he gonna get in?" her voice so thin and fragile that Elijah felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it nearly choked him. "Not while I'm here," he said, though the truth was the barn door's wooden bar was old and rotted, barely holding together. One more hit like that and it might splinter. The man outside dragged something metallic along the wall, a knife, Elijah guessed, from the eerie scraping sound, and then his voice rasped through the storm like a ghost crawling out of the dark, "Little girl, come out now, your mama said you be obedient." Clara's fingers tightened around Elijah's coat as she whimpered, "That's him, that's the man with the knife." Elijah's blood ran cold. He took a slow breath, forcing his panic down, pushing his instincts into sharp clarity. "Clara, listen to me," he whispered, kneeling so he could look her in the eyes, "We're getting out of here, okay? But you have to be brave. Can you do that?" Clara nodded shakily, her tears smearing dirt across her cheeks. The barn door creaked under another blow, and Elijah knew they had seconds. He scanned the barn, spotting a ladder leading to the hayloft. If they could get to the loft and out the back window, maybe the men wouldn't hear them over the storm. Elijah lifted Clara into his arms again and ran for the ladder just as the door cracked down the center, a splinter flying across the barn like a dagger. Elijah climbed with one hand gripping the ladder and the other holding Clara tight against him. The man outside snarled, "You think you can hide her from me, Carter? You don't know what she's worth," and Elijah froze halfway up the ladder. How did this stranger know his name? Clara whimpered into Elijah's shoulder, but he kept climbing, his heart pounding harder with each step. As they reached the loft, the storm wind whistled through the broken boards, and the entire barn felt colder, darker, as if the night itself were holding its breath. Elijah crouched low, carried Clara toward the rear window, and whispered, "Stay quiet, sweetheart. I'm gonna open this slow." The window frame was warped, swollen from years of weather, but he pressed his shoulder against it until it groaned open just enough for Clara to slip through. He lifted her out onto the sloping back roof, then climbed out after her, holding her hand tightly. From inside the barn came a sudden crack as the bar finally snapped and the door crashed open. Elijah heard the boots, heavy and deliberate, stomping inside. The man's voice echoed up toward the loft, "Come on out, Carter. You can't save her. She belongs to me." Elijah felt Clara's tiny fingers trembling inside his, but he whispered, "Don't look back. Just follow me." They crawled across the roof, the rain soaking their clothes, the wind nearly lifting Clara off her knees. Elijah wrapped an arm around her waist to steady her as they edged toward the lower shingles where they could jump into the tall grass behind the barn. But just as Elijah lowered Clara to the edge, lightning flashed, and he saw the men standing in the loft behind them, framed by the broken window, his silhouette unmistakable, his knife gleaming in his hand. Clara screamed as he lunged toward them, but Elijah shoved her off the roof. "Run, Clara. Run!" And then leapt after her, hitting the mud hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. Clara tumbled beside him, crying, but Elijah grabbed her and dragged her toward the tree line as the men punched through the window frame and began climbing out. He's coming!" Clara cried. Elijah turned, fired a shot into the storm, not to hit the man, but to slow him down, but the stranger only laughed, a low, chilling sound that crawled under Elijah's skin. "You think you can keep her?" he shouted. "You don't know what her mother stole." Elijah didn't stop to ask what that meant. He pulled Clara into the trees, moving quickly, keeping low, the forest floor soft and slippery beneath their boots. Branches whipped past them, shadows twisting in the wind, but Elijah's mind stayed sharp. He needed distance, he needed higher ground, he needed somewhere safe. After several minutes, they reached an old hunter's cabin Elijah remembered from years back, a rotting place with no door, but it was shelter. He guided Clara inside and told her, "Stay in the corner. No matter what happens, don't move." Clara nodded, though her sobbing breath made his chest ache. Elijah stood at the doorway, peering into the storm-soaked trees, listening for footsteps. For a moment there was only the wind, then a twig snapped. Elijah raised the revolver, his hand steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins, and called out, "You don't have to do this. The girl isn't yours." But the man only laughed again, closer now, unseen. "She was promised to me," he hissed. "Her blood, her lineage, she belongs to the highest bidder." Elijah's stomach churned. This wasn't random violence. This was trafficking. Exploitation. Something vile, planned, and dangerous. "You won't touch her," Elijah said, his voice low and hard enough to cut stone. The man stepped into view at last, a tall figure, drenched, his face ghostly pale in the lightning, his knife glinting like a shard of frozen moonlight. "You can die for her if you want," he snarled. "But she's coming with me." Elijah didn't hesitate, he fired. The bullet struck the tree beside the men as lightning blinded them both momentarily, and Elijah grabbed Clara, yelling, "Run," again. They bolted out the back of the cabin, Elijah shielding Clara from falling branches and debris as the storm reached its violent peak. They needed a destination, anywhere safer than here. And then Elijah remembered the old ranger station half a mile up the ridge. If they could reach it, maybe there'd be a radio, supplies, something. The storm hammered down relentlessly as Elijah carried Clara through the forest, her arms wrapped around his neck, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "I'm scared." Elijah's reply came as a vow, "You're not alone, Clara. I'm not letting him take you. Not ever." Behind them, distant but steady, came the man's voice again, drifting through the thunder, "You can't run forever, Carter." Elijah ignored it. He kept going until he reached the ridge, breath burning, muscles screaming, but he didn't stop until he saw the faint outline of the ranger station through the storm. He kicked the door open, set Clara inside, and barricaded the entrance with a heavy desk. The room was small, but safer than anywhere else they'd been. Elijah checked the drawers, flare gun, first aid kit, old radio. The radio crackled weakly when he turned it, just enough to give him hope that it might reach someone when the storm eased. Clara sat on a cot, knees hugged to her chest. "Is Mama really gone?" she whispered. Elijah sat beside her, pulling her into his arms. "She saved you, Clara," he said softly. "And I'm gonna make sure her sacrifice wasn't for nothing. You hear me?" Clara nodded, burying her face in his coat. Elijah stroked her hair gently, but his eyes stayed fixed on the door, listening for footsteps. As dawn approached and the storm finally softened into a steady rain, Elijah dared to hope the men had lost their trail, until he heard a slow knock on the door. Just one. Then another. Clara's breath hitched. Elijah stood up, gripping the revolver tightly. The man's voice leaked through the cracks in the wood, calm now, almost patient. "Carter, you can open this door, or I can break it down. The girl belongs to us." Us? Elijah stiffened. So he wasn't alone. Clara's mother had died trying to keep her daughter from whoever these men were, and Elijah had stumbled straight into a war he didn't understand. But he understood enough to know one thing: if these men wanted Clara, it was because she mattered, because she was worth something they were willing to kill for. Elijah stepped between Clara and the door, raising his gun as he whispered, "Stay behind me. No matter what." Clara gripped his coat, her voice trembling, "Are we gonna die?" Elijah didn't look back at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the door as he answered, "No, sweetheart. Not today." He cocked the revolver, the metal clicking like a final promise. "Not while I'm still breathing." And as the door shook under the threat of being broken down again, Elijah knew this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. If anyone watching this story wants the rest, the battles, the revelations, the truth behind who Clara really is and why these men are hunting her, you need to subscribe, stay with us, and keep watching, because this journey is about to get darker, deeper, and far more dangerous, and Elijah Carter is only just beginning to fight.